Robert Allen Stanford was a fifth-generation Texan who transformed himself from a gym owner and real estate speculator into an international banker, at least in appearance. In the 1980s, Stanford capitalized on a downturn in the Texas oil economy by buying distressed Houston properties with his father and selling them for a fortune when the market recovered. Flush with cash, he set his sights offshore. In 1985, Stanford opened a bank on the tiny Caribbean island of Montserrat, taking advantage of the island's lax banking regulations. When British authorities cracked down on Montserrat's offshore banks in the late 1980s, Stanford simply moved his operations to Antigua. There he renamed his institution Stanford International Bank, SIB, and embedded it within a growing Stanford Financial Group empire. In Antigua, Stanford became a dominant figure, its largest private employer and a major economic force. Gaining Antiguan citizenship, he was seen as royalty, building a financial empire with offices across the US, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. With charm and bold promises, he marketed himself as a financial visionary. But behind the polished image, Stanford's offshore bank was built on deception. Stanford's influence peaked in 2006 when Antigua knighted him, Sir Allen, in a lavish ceremony attended by British royalty. He embraced the title, using it to boost his image and credibility. Believed to be worth $2.2 billion by 2008, according to Forbes, Stanford's billionaire persona helped attract investors, though much of that wealth was an illusion. Stanford kept himself in the spotlight as a flashy sports patron, especially through cricket. In 2008, he made headlines by landing a black helicopter at Lord's Cricket Ground, flaunting $20 million in cash for a single match. He also funded Caribbean cricket, created the Stanford 2020 tournament, and built a stadium in Antigua, bolstering his image as a wealthy philanthropist and sports savior. In the United States, Stanford curried favor among politicians and power brokers. He contributed an estimated $1.8 million to U.S. political campaigns, donating to Republicans and Democrats alike. He even snagged photos with American presidents. This political largesse bought Stanford a sheen of legitimacy in Washington. Few questioned why a banker from Antigua was so eager to ingratiate himself with U.S. lawmakers. A silence that, in hindsight, was a costly mistake. With a knighthood, a billionaire's ranking, high-profile sponsorships, and political connections, Allen Stanford appeared every bit the legitimate tycoon. But behind the facade, an enormous fraud was unfolding. Stanford International Bank lured investors with high-return certificates of deposit, CDs, claiming safety and better returns than U.S.-insured banks. Thousands globally trusted the scheme, believing their money was in a diversified, secure portfolio. But behind the promise lay a Ponzi scheme. By 2008, the bank claimed $7 billion in assets, mostly tied to these fraudulent CDs. Its claim returns were entirely fabricated. Internal documents showed he and his team faked investment data and misled clients with false historical results. Instead of a real portfolio, investor funds went into the personal ventures, luxury spending, and risky real estate. The scale of fraud was staggering. Over 2 decades, the scheme pulled in around $7 to $8 billion from investors in 113 countries, ranking it among history's largest Ponzi scams. Stanford International Bank's financial reports were entirely fictional, pure fantasy, as U.S. regulators would later confirm. When the scheme collapsed in 2009, investigators discovered only about $63 million in actual assets left, compared to the $7 billion investors believed was securely stored. The rest had simply vanished, spent by him on his extravagant lifestyle. The so-called safer-than-U.S. banks institution turned out to be little more than Stanford's personal slush fund. Allen Stanford lived like a billionaire, funded entirely by investor money. He owned luxury estates in Florida, Antigua, and St. Croix, traveled on private jets, and sailed on his 112-foot yacht. Prosecutors cited wild spending, including flying in a tailor and live koi fish to stock his personal pond. Stanford funded a lavish lifestyle for his estranged wife, children, and multiple girlfriends, showering them with luxury cars, jewelry, and cash. He used company money for extravagant investor trips and in five-star events that served as personal entertainment. Stanford poured millions into West Indies cricket, launching the Stanford 2020 tournament and building his own stadium in Antigua. In 2008, he flaunted cash and courted media attention by mingling with English players' wives, boosting his image as cricket's flashy benefactor. To outsiders, Stanford's luxurious lifestyle seemed proof of genuine wealth and business success. In reality, every yacht, mansion, and private jet trip was financed by stolen money. Stanford was openly living large at the expense of the very investors he was misleading. Warning signs surrounded Stanford's empire for years, but regulators consistently failed to act decisively. Financial experts questioned how Stanford International Bank consistently delivered high returns regardless of market conditions. As early as the mid-2000s, U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) officials noted Stanford's returns seemed suspiciously too good to be true and began quiet investigations. A former Stanford exec alerted the SEC that the bank was falsifying data, but the agency delayed action. An internal review later admitted it missed chances to stop the Ponzi scheme early. Weak oversight in Antigua also helped. Stanford bribed top regulator Leroy King to block real audits. King tipped him off about investigations and was later sentenced to 10 years for obstructing the SEC. The fraud thrived amid failed U.S. oversight and local corruption. Stanford's U.S. political donations helped shield him from scrutiny, while Antigua's corruption and weak U.S. enforcement let his fraud grow unchecked. Reports later revealed that officials missed clear warning signs. His downfall only came after the 2008 Madoff scandal prompted renewed attention, too late to stop billions in losses. In December 2008, Bernie Madoff's massive $65 billion Ponzi scheme shocked the world, making regulators extra vigilant for other frauds. Suddenly, Allen Stanford's days were numbered. By early February 2009, news broke that multiple U.S. agencies, including the SEC, FBI, FINRA, and state regulators, had teamed up for a coordinated investigation into Stanford Financial Group. The net was finally closing in. On February 17, 2009, the SEC charged Allen Stanford with running a huge Ponzi scheme involving fake high-interest CDs. Federal agents raided his offices the same day, seizing evidence. A judge froze his assets, shut down his businesses, and took his passport to prevent escape. As panic hit Antigua, customers found Stanford's bank doors closed. The Eastern Caribbean Central Bank seized the Bank of Antigua, while Venezuela's regulators took over Stanford Bank Venezuela. Global authorities rushed to limit damage as the fraud's international scale became clear. Allen Stanford did try to escape. Immediately after the SEC raid, Stanford contacted a private jet charter company, urgently trying to fly from the U.S. to Antigua. But with his assets frozen, Stanford offered to pay by credit card, a suspicious request that prompted the charter company to demand cash upfront instead. Unable to secure the funds, Stanford's escape plan collapsed. 2 days later, on February 19, 2009, FBI agents tracked Stanford to a townhouse in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he was hiding at his girlfriend's home. The FBI handed him the SEC lawsuit, ending his brief disappearance and crushing his hopes of fleeing to the Caribbean. Instead of a glamorous escape, Stanford's saga concluded quietly, in front of waiting journalists and law enforcement. As the civil case progressed, overwhelming evidence of fraud emerged. On February 27, 2009, the SEC updated its lawsuit, explicitly labeling Stanford's empire a massive Ponzi scheme, revealing that the bank's claimed profits and investment records were entirely fake. The illusion of safety vanished overnight. Investors around the globe, from Houston to London and Caracas, were devastated, realizing their life savings might be gone forever. The government's swift action had ended Stanford's scheme, but one critical question remained. Would Stanford face criminal charges? That answer came clearly in the summer of 2009. On June 18, 2009, Allen Stanford was arrested after surrendering to the FBI. Once a symbol of luxury, he now faced court in handcuffs. He and key associates, including his CIO and CFO, were charged with running a $7 billion Ponzi scheme, one of the largest financial frauds in U.S. history. Stanford was brought back to Houston, Texas, once the heart of his empire, to face justice. On June 25, 2009, he appeared in a Houston courtroom, pleading not guilty to every charge. His attorneys insisted that regulators had unfairly destroyed his business and requested bail. However, the judge viewed Stanford as a serious flight risk, especially given his overseas connections and previous escape attempt. On June 30th, Stanford was ordered held without bail until trial. Suddenly, the extravagant financier was trading his luxurious mansions for a tiny jail cell. While Stanford waited in jail, prosecutors were busy strengthening their case. In August 2009, James Davis, Stanford's closest ally and CFO, struck a plea deal, admitting guilt on fraud and conspiracy charges. Davis confessed to falsifying records and misleading investors, agreeing to cooperate fully with investigators. His testimony became a crucial turning point, giving prosecutors an inside look at exactly how Stanford's Ponzi scheme was run and concealed. With Davis on their side, the government now had detailed evidence, dealing a severe blow to Stanford's defense. Stanford's pretrial jail time was turbulent. In 2009, he was injured in a jail fight, with his lawyers later claiming memory loss and trauma. His mental state deteriorated, and he became dependent on anxiety meds. By 2010, he claimed major memory gaps, prompting a judge to delay the trial and send him to a prison hospital for evaluation. Doctors found severe memory loss, though some suspected he was faking to avoid prosecution. By late 2011, Stanford's medical condition had improved significantly after treatment. In December, Judge David Hittner ruled that Stanford was fit to stand trial, determining his memory issues weren't severe enough to hinder his defense. Finally, after almost 2.5 years behind bars, Stanford's trial was set for January 2012 in Houston. Meanwhile, Antigua sought to distance itself from Stanford's scandal. In 2009, Antigua's National Honors Committee voted unanimously to strip Stanford of his knighthood. The decision became official in 2010 when the Governor General formally revoked Stanford's title and medal. The once proud Sir Allen would face justice simply as Mr. Stanford. Allen Stanford's trial began on January 24, 2012, in Houston. Prosecutors laid out his 2-decade fraud, exposing fake reports, bribes, and false claims of wealth. James Davis, his CFO, testified that they moved investor money and faked records. Ex-employees described being pressured to lie. Despite the damning evidence, Stanford remained confident and often smiled during the 6-week trial. On March 6, 2012, Allen Stanford was found guilty on 13 of 14 criminal charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The verdict marked the end of a 2-decade Ponzi scheme that defrauded around 18,000 victims worldwide, second in scale only to Madoff's. On June 14th, Stanford was sentenced to 110 years in prison by U.S. District Judge David Hittner, sealing the downfall of the once glamorous financier. Judge Hittner read all 350 victim letters before sentencing Allen Stanford, ordering him to forfeit $5.9 billion, though most funds had vanished. Stanford remained defiant, claiming he wasn't a thief and blaming the U.S. government. His lack of remorse drew harsh words from prosecutors. While the conviction offered some justice, recovery for Stanford's 18,000 victims, mostly everyday people like retirees and veterans, has been slow and incomplete. One victim told the court, "He stole more than millions. He stole our lives." After Stanford's collapse, victims saw little recovery. A court-appointed receiver, Ralph Janvey, found just $63 million in Stanford's accounts, far short of the $7 billion owed. Over a decade, only about $1 billion was recovered until 2023, when a $1.2 billion settlement with TD Bank boosted that total to $2.7 billion. Still, most victims got back only a fraction. The 2010 report blamed SEC delays for missing early red flags, prompting post-Madoff reforms to improve regulatory coordination and offshore oversight. Investors learned a painful truth. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Many later admitted they ignored red flags due to Stanford's charm and polished image. In Antigua, his collapse devastated the economy. Businesses closed, jobs were lost, and trust was shattered. The government cut ties, stripped his knighthood, and struggled to restore credibility as a financial hub. Locals felt deeply betrayed, realizing one outsider's greed had destabilized their tight-knit island of just 85,000 people. Today, Allen Stanford is serving his 110-year prison sentence at a high-security federal facility in Florida, with no chance of release until 2010, a life sentence for the 75-year-old former billionaire. Gone are the extravagant lifestyle, knighthood, and expensive suits. Stanford now appears as just another inmate in a prison uniform. Stanford's stunning fall serves as a stark warning about the destructive power of greed and deceit. Once praised as a financial visionary, he became a symbol of how easily trust can be manipulated. His story underscores the critical need for vigilant regulation, reinforcing the timeless lesson. If an investment seems consistently too good to be true, it almost certainly is. His legacy lives on in tighter oversight and, sadly, in the broken lives of thousands of investors. A sobering reminder of the real-world harm one fraudulent financier can cause. If this cautionary tale made you rethink your investments or just blew your mind, smash that like button, share this video with your friends so they're smarter about their savings, and subscribe for more incredible stories of scams, scandals, and everything in between. Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.